Now you might think you know the relative merits and strengths and weaknesses of the cuirass versus the brigandine, but do you actually? Let's do a deep dive on the comparison between these two. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. This is my cuirass, one of them anyway, and this is my brigandine. You've seen both of them on this channel quite a bit before, but today and yesterday I noticed a few discussions about the relative merits of the cuirass, the solid plate cuirass, versus the brigandine, and these are contemporary. These are from the same time period. So why did some people wear one and some people wear the other? Now some of you will instantly think of some answers that you believe you know. But let's actually unpick some of these answers and see how correct they are. So the first answer I often people see is the brigandine was cheaper. Was that always true? Not necessarily always. So it is generally true to say that there were cheap brigandines, but there were also hugely expensive brigandines. So here I've got an earlier style of breastplate, and this was worn over a mail shirt, sometimes in conjunction with a corazzina type construction, which is a little bit like a brigandine in fairness. So sometimes these two things were married together. So we actually find a combination of a back made of laminated plates like this and a front with a breastplate on the front of it. And in fact, if we look at areas like the Holy Roman Empire, particularly Germany and Switzerland, we could say as well, and Austria, we actually find that breastplates were used for common soldiery more than brigandines. In fact, we don't find many brigandines in, for example, Germany in this period. So there were munitions grade cheap breastplates. Obviously there were later in the 16th century, but even in this period, so common soldiers in some areas didn't wear brigandines. They sometimes wore breastplates instead. So cost wasn't always a factor for the common soldiery. And in fact, there were really expensive brigandines as well. So what we find is in the various records that we have available to us, like ordnances, we find references to really expensive brigandines made of hardened steel. We'll come back to that topic in a second. But moreover, the fabric used to cover them was sometimes hugely expensive velvet, and very powerful and wealthy nobles sometimes had very expensive brigandines with gilded rivet heads and very expensive velvet or other fabric, silk, used over the plates, and very high quality steel plates underneath. So there were really expensive brigandines and much cheaper brigandines. And indeed, while an average brigandine was cheaper than an average full plate cuirass, as we've seen, there were also munition breastplates and similar things like that made. So generally speaking, it's true that a high-end knight's cuirass was more expensive than an average brigandine. There were cheaper cuirasses and more expensive brigandines. Now the next answer that usually comes up is that the brigandine was not as protective as the plate cuirass. Again, it depends. Okay, so as mentioned, there were cuirasses which were actually proved against crossbows and longbows of the time. So we actually find particularly in the French and Burgundian ordinances, we actually find references to brigandines of different proofs, essentially. Brigandines of different strengths and toughnesses, and they were tested against the missile weapons and sometimes hand weapons of the day. So while it's generally true that perhaps the most hardcore protection available was the plate, especially the double layered with a placard breastplate as part of a plate cuirass, there were also some very, very tough brigandines. So I don't want you to think that a brigandine is in any way weak, especially when the brigandine was very often, in fact I would say usually, worn over a mail shirt. So when you've got a mail shirt over a doublet and then you've got a brigandine over the top, you actually have two levels of really tough protection that should protect you against pretty much all, or very much most under normal circumstances, hand and missile weapons of the day. However, the reason why I'd say that the plate cuirass is a more hardcore protection is it's not flexible. Now we'll talk about pros and cons in a second, because obviously flexibility can be an advantage, but just talking about it as a disadvantage for a second, the fact that this is a solid hardened steel bridge essentially, or dome over your chest, is clearly advantageous when you're being hit by something like a poleaxe. Or, for example, I wouldn't particularly want to be hit hard in the middle of the chest with a poleaxe against this brigandine. Not because it would penetrate the brigandine, it wouldn't, but because the flexibility of the brigandine means that I might come away from it with a broken rib or a broken sternum, whereas that is not going to happen with the solid cuirass. Now, when we step that up to something like the mounted lance on horseback with the arret, no, I don't particularly want to be taking that in the middle of a brigandine. However, breastplates take it on a regular basis. In fact, if we take this even one step further, as we get towards the end of the 15th and into the 16th century, and in fact all the way into the 17th century, we even find breastplates which are bulletproof. They are pistol proof and in some cases even musket proof. So you can make a breastplate which is able to take even the firearms of the day up to a certain point. However, not really the case with a brigandine. So once again, I don't want you to think that the brigandine is anyway a crap defence. It's actually an incredibly effective and very, very strong defence that most weapons of the 14th, 15th century wouldn't stand any chance of getting through. However, it's just not quite up there at the top tier as a period cuirass could be. But just to caveat that with the fact that munition breastplates might be a lot thinner, made of iron or mild steel, not hardened, and in fact in some cases you might find that some of the top tier brigandines are actually more protective and more penetration resistant than some of the cheaper breastplates. So there's a big overlap again. They are not two separated categories, they are two overlapping categories. It's just that the top end cuirasses can just go higher up in protectiveness compared to the top level of brigandines. And just also to add to that, remember that this isn't really about steel quality, because often brigandines were made of hardened carbon spring steel essentially, and in some cases brigandines and jacks were actually made of chopped up bits of old breastplates, so they were the exact same metal in fact as some of the cuirasses. So it wasn't the metallurgy was any worse on a brigandine. In some cases it was better than a munition breastplate. It's more the fact that the flexibility of the brigandine could sometimes work against you against certain types of weapon or impact. So the next point that often comes up is that brigandines are lighter than plate cuirasses. Again, there's an overlap. You could have, theoretically, you could make a really heavy brigandine and you could make a really light cuirass. However, the tendency is that generally speaking, yes, this is true. Most brigandines, when you weigh them, tend to be lighter rather than most full cuirasses. But remember that the cuirass covers a larger area, and that's part of the reason. Also the fact that you've got double layers on the breastplate and things like that. But if we go down to a munition breastplate, actually this could be lighter than a brigandine. So at this point you might be yelling at the screen, Matt, you just answer every question with "it depends." Well, hopefully I've shown that there is generally a yes or no answer to these. It's just that usually it's not that there's a black and white split, but there's an overlap. These next 3 points, actually there is a more definitive answer to each. Firstly, is the brigandine more comfortable to wear than the cuirass? Yes. Generally speaking, but yes, it basically is. And that is one of the massive advantages of a brigandine. It's a flexible defence. It's not as flexible as mail. Mail is the ultimate flexible defence, but obviously comes with disadvantages as a consequence of that. Plate is probably the maximum degree of protection, at least at its highest level when it's fully encompassing. But the disadvantage of it being rigid is that it's rigid. And very clearly, if you make a defence flexible, that can be a disadvantage against certain types of impact. However, the advantage is it's flexible. So fundamentally, yes, this is much more comfortable to wear. And there's a couple of examples of very common movements that mean that when we're doing, for example, armoured fight training, wearing a brigandine or wearing a cuirass is a decision that we often face, and depending on the environment and the type of fighting we're doing and how long we're going to be spending in armour, we might decide to wear that, we might decide to wear that. The reason why I might decide to wear this is because it gives me a bigger range of motion across here without any real friction. When people fight in armour with breastplates, you'll notice we have this hard edge around here, and that often results, I'm sure many of you out here, if you've worn armour, will have experienced this, with little amount of bruising around here. Now the fact that you wear mail underneath, mail voiders, actually protects you from that. It's not like skin into metal. You've got your doublet, you've got your male voider, and then you've got the steel edge. So it's not that bad, and often you don't notice it at the time, but when you take your armour off, we often have a bit of bruising or a bit of red marks up here. And that's indicative of the fact that when we move the arms across here, for example, when you're swinging a poleaxe or doing whatever, grappling, you're coming into contact with a hard edge, and you just don't really have a hard edge with a brigandine. The next example I'm going to give is picking something off the floor. Now, very obviously, you have some degree of flexibility where the upper breast meets the placard, and of course where the fold can flex here. So absolutely, if I drop my poleaxe when I'm in full harness, I can bend my knees and bend my body and go down and pick up the poleaxe, but it is more restrictive, it is harder than in a brigandine. In a brigandine, I can easily lift kick my foot up, which I can do in plate as well, with no resistance whatsoever, and I can easily just bend down and touch the floor as if I was wearing normal clothes. So because it's more flexible, it flexes more like clothes. Now the next question is, brigandine easier to get on and off than a plate harness? 100% yes. Plate harness takes quite some time to get on. It's quicker to get off. Generally speaking, a harness comes off quicker than it goes on, but you absolutely need help doing it. With a brigandine, as you can see as I'm doing here, it is no problem at all to do the whole thing yourself, really quite quickly. That one's probably the hardest on this particular brig, and I'll just move the microphone for a second up to there, but hopefully you will see that in no time at all I can get the brig off. That is absolutely not something I can do for myself in a plate cuirass. Now there is one small caveat. I am comparing here to the complete cuirass like this, which has both back and breast, has a two-part breast which needs to be buckled there and buckled there, and of course it has a fold. This means that when I'm putting it on, these buckles at the back and the front need to be done up, these buckles at the top need to be done up, you can't reach those yourself, and all of these straps down the right hand side, in my case, of the fold or skirt need to be done up as well. And potentially if you've got tassets on as well, the tassets need to be done, which you can just about do yourself, but it's not very easy, and you can't do the back ones yourself if you've got back ones. So fundamentally, wearing a plate cuirass requires either servants, preferably 2 of them for each night, or the help of friends. Now you can dress each other, but obviously it's more difficult because each of you is wearing armour and has less flexibility than servants not wearing armour would have. So it is more of a palaver to put those on and off. A brigandine is way easier, and you can do it all yourself. And if you need someone to do one particular strap because you can't reach it, then one of your friends can easily do that in a couple of seconds. The other caveat to mention, of course, is we're not just talking about a simple munition breastplate here. But what's interesting is, even with these, you tend to not be able to put them on just by yourself very easily. There might be exceptions. There might be 16th century munition cuirasses which possibly you can just about sort of worm your way into yourself. But generally speaking, even simple munition breastplates, or if you've got you know, tassets and a fold, even sort of pikeman's armour of the 17th century requires another person to help you. A brigandine, you can, especially if it buckles at the front or perhaps even at the sides, you can easily do yourself. Now the last point, or last question rather, that comes up is a brigandine less durable? And again, the simple answer here would be yes. Fundamentally because all of these plates, and it's useful that I've got this off now because I can show you, all of these plates on the inside, so that's all hardened spring tempered steel, is held together by virtue of the fact it's riveted to a fabric garment at the front, and that's the same with a coat of plates or a corazina. So fundamentally, if that fabric rips, rots, gets burned, that is ruining the thing which holds together those plates. So while those plates are very strong, they are reliant on the fabric garment on the outside, and sometimes you get some which have leather. But regardless, whether it's leather or fabric of any kind, and usually there's canvas, and then, so it's not just the fabric you see there, there's canvas and then there's wool felt or velvet over the top of that. But that fabric, if that comes apart, or if it rots, then yes, it will fall apart. Now you could say, okay, this is all steel, but you could say this is also reliant on leathers as well, because inside there are leather straps holding everything together. Some of the plates are connected by hinges, for example. So we've got hinges down this side here, but at this side we've got belts and straps. At the top we've got straps. As you saw on the inside, you've got what are known as leathers, essentially straps on the inside. So that is still held together with leather. It's just that as a percentage of less of it is held together with leather or fabric compared to the Brigandine. And I would say overall, in bad weather, for example, which is something I've touched on in a previous video, the Brigandine is probably overall more vulnerable to wear and tear on campaign than a cuirass is. However, they can both be fixed, and any military equipment, be it weapons, shields, carts, horse trappings, whatever, is going to get damaged, is going to get wear and tear on campaign. So you have to accept that all things are going to get wear and tear. But yes, I would say that a cuirass is probably more durable overall as a percentage than the Brigandine is. So hopefully I've covered all the bases there. The basic reason why we usually see Brigandines on common soldiers like archers, billmen, pikemen, things like this, at least in certain parts of Europe. Obviously, as I mentioned, in some parts we see munition breastplates instead. But the reason why we see Brigandine on them rather than perhaps so often these are all of the aforementioned reasons, but primarily cost. Generally, even though we do get expensive Brigandines and we do get cheap cuirasses, generally speaking a cuirass is more expensive to make than a Brigandine. But perhaps more importantly than that, the Brigandine's more versatile for a typical soldier to wear. I can happily wear a Brigandine all day and barely even notice it. When you first put it on, it's a bit of weight, it's a little bit cumbersome, but once it's on, it's flexible, it's comfortable, it doesn't really chafe, it doesn't restrict your movement very much. You can bend down, climb up ladders, dig, operate a bow, load artillery. You can do all of these things easily in a Brigandine. Once you start to put on a plate cuirass, you become a much more specialised type of soldier, and a lot of things become a real pain in the butt to do. And I'll tell you, when you've had plate cuirass on for 2 or 3 hours, it is always a big relief to take it off. So while it is designed to fit you and sit well on your body and be relatively flexible within certain parameters, it is never as comfortable or as flexible or as versatile as a Brigandine is. So a Brigandine is a far more appropriate type of armour to stick on your typical soldiers. And as we know, sometimes the people that could afford the plate harness, the kings, the emperors, all the way down through the knights and the squires, they sometimes chose, as we sometimes choose, instead of wearing the cuirass, to keep the rest of their plate harness on, but wear a Brigandine instead, because the Brigandine is sometimes, so long as you're not being hit necessarily by lances or such like, is sometimes more comfortable, more versatile to wear, especially if you're going to have to be wearing it all day and you might want maximum manoeuvrability and flexibility. I hope that's been interesting, thought-provoking. Did I miss any points? Feel free to post down below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.